Hello and good afternoon and welcome to the IRM's webinar on mitigating the risks and impact of changing sanctions regimes. So this is an IRM webinar sponsored by LexisNexis, so our thanks goes to them. And welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. So my name is Arthur Piper and I'm just going to do some quick introductions and a sort of idiot guide to what sanctions are, and then you'll hear the real thing from our other participants in a few minutes. So I'm the editor of the IRM's magazine Enterprise Risk. With us today we have Mark Dunn. Hello Mark.
Yes, hello there.
He is Head of Equity and Due Diligence and Monitoring at LexisNexis Business Insight Solutions. And Mark is going to be running us through the general contours of the characteristics of global sanctions regime and some tips on how to manage those risks. Also with us today is Zia Ullah. Hello Zia.
Hello.
He is partner and head of corporate crime and investigations at Evershed Sutherland. Zia is ranked in the Legal 500 and he advises top-tier financial and corporate institutions on all aspects of corporate and financial crime compliance. He's also an FCA approved skills person for financial crime. So let's just move on to a very, very brief understanding of sanctions risk, or at least as I understand it, and you'll get the full details as we go along from Mark and Zia. So just before I start on this, I'd just like to say to our audience to keep the questions coming in. But can you be patient with us, because we're going to save the questions till the end. So as something occurs to you, you can send us a question which we will see, but we're unlikely to address that question until the last 15 minutes or so, and hopefully we'll have a discussion of some of those points that have been raised. So sanctions risk then. So sanctions, as you're all probably aware, are increasingly used by governments. And in very, very broad terms, a sanction is simply a ban, a barrier or a restriction on trade or some other activity aimed at changing the target's behaviour. Increasingly recently, non-compliance with sanctions has been attracting severe penalties, and Mark's going to run through some of those penalties. But sanctions are not actually without their critics. People think they don't work or that it disrupts GDP, but we won't be going into that aspect of it at the moment, because whether you agree with them or not, they're here for the foreseeable future. But given the size and nature and the penalties of sanctions, sanction risk is a real and growing risk area. So today I'll just kind of briefly talk you through, and then I'll hand over to Mark. Here is the format that we're going to have today. Mark is going to talk us through what sanctions are. Then Zia is going to pick up the baton and talk about what companies' legal obligations are under sanctions. And also he's going to share some of his experience with us and give us two case studies to see how sanctions actually work in practice and what sanction risk is in a financial services firm and in a corporation. Then we'll hand back over to Mark, who will give us 20 top tips. They're in two groups, one for implementing sanctions in a compliance policy, and the other one is for when you're considering purchasing sanction screening software. So that's all for me. I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who will start talking about sanctions and the current sanctions regime. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks very much, Arthur. And yes, good afternoon, everybody. I thought I'd just start the session today by almost, in a way, level setting what sanctions are, just building on the brief introduction from Arthur. And as we go through this session, we'll talk more and more in depth about these different measures that are in place. But essentially, sanctions are effectively instruments of a diplomatic or economic nature that are really introduced to bring about a change, whether that's to restrict an individual or an organization or a particular entity in the way they operate. It may be to restrict countries from perhaps posing a perceived threat to global security. So different measures that can be implemented to try and bring about change and to try and introduce higher levels of security and prevent risk. And if we think about the different types of sanctions, there's a whole range of different measures that can be introduced. I'm just listing some of these on the page here. So arms embargoes, travel bans, asset freezes, reduced diplomatic links. There may be reductions or cessation of military relationships. There could be flight bans over certain markets or regions, suspensions from international organizations, withdrawal of aid. So various measures that can be brought in to force, which are designed really to be an alternative to military action. And increasingly, these measures can be effectively ramped up and become more intense to try and bring increased pressure on the country, the individual, the organization or entity that the measures are designed to restrict or coerce. Okay, so if we have a look at some of the primary examples of sanctions regimes and some of the agencies that are implementing and to an extent enforcing these regimes, and we'll go on, as I mentioned, and look in more detail at examples of these as we go through the session. So let's start with some examples of the United Nations sanctions. And by far the UN is the highest authority producing the most number of sanctions that are applied globally by the different UN member states. So we have 193 member states within the UN, obviously introducing sanctions measures through Security Council resolutions and effectively bringing in a whole range of measures that each member state is expected to then implement locally and enforce. Now that may not always be the case because the UN's influence and their ability to actually have each market enforcing or each member state enforcing those measures is limited, but ultimately that's the aim and the goal of the UN. So really building on Chapter 7 and looking to secure global security. So you'll see as we go through examples of sanctions, many of the sanctions implemented by individual countries often originate from that UN list and from the United Nations Security Council resolutions. We have another look at an example of an enforcement or implementing body. So here we have the European Union, and again introducing sanctions measures through the common foreign and security policy, so the framework by which many of the United Nations Security Council resolutions are introduced into the EU markets, and again each member state is expected to abide and apply those sanctions. And that may be done in different ways. So there may be the UN measures coming in place, there may be EU autonomous measures that are specific just to the EU and may not have occurred on the UN list. Or there could be additional measures that the UN resolutions have introduced, so where the EU is actually augmenting those resolutions and adding additional measures on top of that. So essentially that will be produced and published through a consolidated list, and the EU is obviously a prime mover of sanctions with its local member states. We then have a highly influential, very proactive body in the US Office of Foreign Assets Control, linked to the US Department of Treasury, and really tasked with administering the US sanctions regime. Now we'll talk a lot more about OFAC as we go through the session, because by far OFAC is the most proactive agency globally when it comes to enforcing and implementing sanctions measures. And very often a company's sanctions policy will start with the OFAC measures as the foundation and build from there if there is any kind of US association with the company's business. So we'll talk a lot more about OFAC as we go through the session. And then turning to the UK market, so another example of a local implementing body here. We have the UK HM Treasury, so implementing sanctions through the Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation. And again, the UK will often republish many of the UN Security Council resolutions. Obviously, we'll add to that the EU specific measures that may have been introduced, and again, publishing those through a consolidated list. So ultimately, you have a number of these different agencies around the world. Often you can access the sanctions list through their websites, and in some cases they offer a simple search facility. So if you have a limited number of sanctions you need to check, perhaps a limited number of entities you need to screen, it is possible to do that by going to the websites directly. But as we'll see later in the presentation, if you have a high number of entities to monitor and many markets and many lists to really keep track of, it's obviously not very practical or efficient or really considered appropriate to go off and search each individual website separately. Okay, so let's move on to the next slide. I talked about OFAC briefly. Again, we will talk more about OFAC. They are very influential. Most of the enforcement action is coming from the US government and the Office of Foreign Assets Control. This is an example of the regimes currently in place from the US. This is as of the 15th of October. And you can see multiple markets, multiple actions, most of which do originate from the United Nations Security Council resolutions. But there will be some specific local measures, so for example, the sanctions in place with Cuba, and there may be certain measures that go beyond what the UN Security Council resolutions set out. And we'll talk a little bit more, again, as we go through the session about certain examples in the market, but OFAC is again in the headlines. There are new measures expected to be brought in force against Iran through the OFAC facility, which are due to take place from the 5th of November. So there's a lot of attention on that at the moment, and the US government stance through OFAC against the Iranian regime. But again, we'll talk more about that as we go into the session today. So that was really just a high-level start to begin our webinar, just to level set what sanctions are, give you some examples of some of the agencies out there, some of the more influential bodies that are implementing and to an extent enforcing these measures. Okay, so if I now turn over to Zia, and we'll talk more about the legal obligations and further details on those. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Mark. If we can move to the next slide, Arthur, please. Yeah, as Mark has outlined, the regimes themselves are effectively split between the jurisdictions that you're considering. So we as UK or EU entities, as an example, have to consider what our local law obligations are versus, Mark has mentioned, the OFAC regime, US obligations that may not directly apply to us but may have an impact. And so when considering the varying regimes, it's in my experience, it's always good to try and split out what the relevant legislative sources are, who they target, what the impact is, what they oblige you to do, and what the penalties are. If you follow that process, you can break down the obligations, the varying sanctions impart upon both individuals and entities and other persons. Now, as Mark has outlined, at the highest level you have the United Nations implementing Security Council resolutions. They are then implemented via, at the moment, before Brexit, an EU regulation for EU member states, and then once they're published, that they become directly directly effective in the relevant EU member states. But to have any criminal sanctions, to have any teeth underscoring that particular regulation, there has to be a domestic piece of legislation implemented. So in the United Kingdom, we'd have a statutory instrument that implements the criminal penalties for non-compliance with the EU regulation. Now, we have only recently, actually, in recent times, utilised the EU mechanism to implement UN sanctions, but that's how they are implemented. But we, as a member of the United Nations, we have a separate piece of legislation in the UK, the UN Act, that we used to implement UN Security Council resolutions under. We then also have a couple of pieces of domestic legislation focusing on terrorism. The main one is the Terrorist Asset Freezing Act of 2010, by way of which domestic persons are designated under our terrorism legislation. There is another piece of legislation, the Counter-Terrorism Act of 2008, that also has some sanctions impact, but we won't spend too much time on that because it's not really going to be utilised in the future, I don't think, for the purpose of sanctions. But essentially, the main element of our sanctions regime, from a UK perspective, at the moment, comes from EU regulations. As I say, up until Brexit, they will be grandfathered over post-Brexit, so we will still comply once we leave the EU. But the varying regimes, so at the moment there are in excess of 20 regimes covering jurisdictions that I'm sure most of us have heard about, so jurisdictions like Iran, North Korea, Syria, etc., Russia to a degree, are covered by these varying EU regulations, and they all have differing targets. So historically we would have individuals on a list, and the list that Mark referred to and we'll talk about in more detail later on. But as sanctions become more complex and more complicated, those targets have also included then entities and then sectors like the oil and gas sector, precious metal sector. Rather strangely, the wood and carving sector is a target under the North Korean sanctions regime, and then also governments themselves. Well, the impact of those sanctions then it effectively obligates citizens, individuals and entities incorporated within the EU and the UK to comply, and they have extraterritorial effects. So wherever those individuals and entities are doing business, they'll be impacted by the sanctions that are in play. What are the obligations under those regimes? Well, they vary. At the simplest level, they generally sanctions will oblige, financial sanctions will oblige individuals and entities, well, entities mainly, to freeze the funds of those designees that the assets of whom they come into contact with, not to provide economic resources directly or indirectly to those designees, and not to circumvent sanctions. The penalties will vary from state to state, but effectively they are unlimited fines for both individuals and entities, and also imprisonment for individuals. If we move on to the next slide, please, Arthur. That's a very quick canter through the EU, UN and UK regimes. As you might imagine, and as was hinted to by Mark in the context of enforcement, the US sanctions regime is the most complex there is internationally. If we go back, sorry, please. We're still on legal framework? Yeah. One more, please. Forward. The US sanctions regime is the most complex, and the sources down the left-hand side there, I apologize for all the abbreviations, but the sources are plentiful from a US perspective. Each individual regime generally has its own legislative framework, although there isn't a framework, a generic framework underscores the US sanctions at a high level. So they implement UN Security Council resolutions, just like the EU and the UK do, but then they have a piece of legislation called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, which effectively gives the President authority to implement sanctions at will in relation to varying emergencies that he sees fit. And then for each regime there will be a set of regulations. These are the code for federal regulations that will give you the details of what each regime has in force. And they're really the bits of information that are worth, if you ever have a question from a US sanctions perspective, looking on OFAC's website, seeking out the Code of Federal Regulations for each particular regime. And as I mentioned, the President has his authority under executive orders to issue his own sanctions as he sees fit, but that is generally limited in terms of what he can and can't do via Congress. Now, the remaining abbreviations I list there are pieces of legislation that link to both Cuba and Iran. As just as examples, that's not the totality of the sources of US sanctions legislation by any means. The Comprehensive Iranian Sanctions Accountability Divestment Act, the Iran Threat Reduction Act, CATSA, these are all probably bits of legislation you may have heard of over the course of the last few years, and they each have differing obligations and have each introduced an element of complexity into the US sanctions regimes that means it's become harder than ever to seek to comply with those obligations. The targets are broadly the same as you'd see from the EU perspective, except that the US has 3 or 4 regimes, those being Iran, North Korea, Syria in particular, and Crimea to a limited degree, that effectively stop any activity with that jurisdiction, aside from a few exemptions that are written into law for things like humanitarian activity or the activity of the UN as an example. US sanctions, as you might expect, impact US persons. US persons are US citizens, entities incorporated in the United States and their branches, their foreign branches. Any US dollar transaction is impacted by US sanctions because those dollar transactions have to be cleared by a US bank. And so they do have so-called extraterritorial effect as well. The obligations are, again, broadly similar to those we see in the EU. So using the terms blocking instead of freezing, you block the funds if you hold funds for designated targets under the US regimes. You report to OFAC if you have such funds. You notify if you know that someone is trying to circumvent, etc. It's probably worth mentioning that aside from those parties that are designated and listed on the on the OFAC SDN list as an example, those entities that they own 50% or more will also be designated even if they're not listed. And again, Mark may well talk about this in the context of KYC and due diligence in terms of understanding who you're dealing with from a sanctions perspective. But it's important to note that the 2 sanctions regimes, namely the Cuban and Iranian sanctions regimes, apply to foreign incorporated US-owned and controlled entities. So the Cuban and the Iranian ones in particular apply in that context. And again, you probably get a sense of the complexity of these varying regimes as we see the fact that only those 2 particular regimes are covered by that particular rule. The penalties are extremely harsh. Again, imprisonment for individuals, fines set out in statute for corporates. And it's the penalties that we've seen from a US perspective that have really driven the sanctions compliance agenda over the past decade, with fines reaching nearly $9 billion in the case of BNP Paribas. Next slide, please, Arthur. Just worth, I think, mentioning at this stage that I set out for you there in a bit more detail what the framework says. We can skip that. They're effectively giving you details of what funds and economic resources are in the context of what I've talked about in terms of freezing. So we can move to the next slide. Thank you, Arthur. And again, that just sets out for you what funds and economic resources are. They're effectively there to capture every kind of asset that you might come across in the context of dealing with an individual or entity's assets, and ensures that it captures most, if not all, economic activity. So let's just move on very briefly to sanctions obligations. As I mentioned in the previous slides, from a UK perspective, all UK individuals and businesses have to comply with sanctions under our laws. If you are regulated, you have other sanctions obligations to comply with that go beyond what the general obligations are, which again we'll talk about later on in brief terms. I've mentioned to you that from a US sanctions perspective, they capture US persons. Well, US persons is quite broadly defined. So I've mentioned US citizens, but it also captures permanent residents, green card holders, wherever they're located or employed, which obviously gives problems and causes problems to US nationals who are working in other jurisdictions where they may have conflict of laws issues from a sanctions perspective. I've mentioned the 50% owned or controlled rules for the Cuban and Iranian sanctions regime. I've also mentioned US dollar transactions as well. So I suppose that's at a very high level what the legislative framework looks like, and we've gone through that very quickly. But I think more importantly for most people, the questions that we get generally are, well, that's great. I understand that I've got obligations from the EU or US or a UK perspective, but how do I comply? And the answer is it depends on who you are and where you are as to the level of compliance that you're going to have. The level of and complexity of the framework that you're going to have to implement in the context of your sanctions compliance. Unfortunately, from a legal perspective, as we've just outlined, those legislative frameworks don't effectively tell you the processes that you've got to adopt to achieve compliance with your legal obligations. You do see that in the context of regulated businesses. So, for example, the FCA, in the Financial Conduct Authority in the United Kingdom, and the main regulator in the United Kingdom, OFSI, the Office for Financial Sanctions Implementation, provide guidance as to how to achieve compliance with sanctions obligations. But again, they do that to varying degrees, but at a high level. Effectively, it's left to companies to understand what their sanctions risk is, and as the IRM would tell you, that's achieved by a variety of means. But the main means is a risk assessment outlining where your main areas of sanctions risk is, and then defining and creating group or individual policies based upon that risk, and then training people about how best to comply within your individual organisations in that context. Obviously, one of the key elements of complying will be conducting customer due diligence, depending again on what type of business you are, on an onboarding and ongoing basis, and again, depending on whether you're regulated or not, will give you some further obligations in the context of what regulatory expectations there are in the context of customer due diligence and ongoing diligence, generally in the context of sanctions compliance. If you do discover that you are dealing with a party that is a sanctioned party, then again, depending on your regulated status, you will have some reporting obligations to consider, and failing to do so can be a separate criminal offence. Mark will talk in more detail about sanction screening in the later slides, but effectively, again, depending on the type of business that you are, you may well have to carry out, to effectively comply with sanctions, daily ongoing screening of your customers, your transactions, your employees, your third parties, your correspondence, etc., to truly understand whether in fact you are dealing with a sanctioned individual or entity or jurisdiction, for that matter, as you deal with your commercial risk going forward. I suppose relevant to everyone, as I just mentioned, are going to be the risk assessment, the policies and procedures, the training, CDD, etc. The one thing I suppose that's really causing problems within the regulated space at the moment is this issue around correspondent banking and treasury banking risk as well. Now, I say for regulated businesses, I suppose it also applies for any unregulated businesses that maintain bank accounts. And again, it won't be a surprise if you've received questionnaires or requests from your bank asking you to outline what steps you take to mitigate your sanctions risk, because that's having an upstream effect on those banks themselves, and they're having to respond to their regulators in country about what mitigants they've got in place to ensure that they are minimising their own sanctions risk. I think at the heart of that is know your customer and know your customer's customer. And I mentioned to you some of the ownership and control rules earlier on, and that's really important both from an EU and US perspective. Understanding in particular the structure of entities and who they're ultimately owned by is critical to understanding sanctions compliance risk, and it's where a number of parties have fallen down over recent times in the context of enforcement action, and where really most of our clients are focusing their attention trying to understand what ownership and control structure are in place, because it's been shown in numerous not only sanctions cases but money laundering and bribery and corruption cases that complex ownership structures are utilised to try and obfuscate the fact that, for example, sanctioned individuals or entities play a part in the ownership chain of particular entities in particular jurisdictions, and the regulator expects parties to understand those persons that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And as I say, there is specific regulatory expectation from the FCA in the United Kingdom. So market practice here is for overnight sanction screening, sophisticated screening software like Lexis to enable and to help with that obligation. Even though screening as an obligation isn't enshrined in law, there is a regulatory expectation that it is conducted, particularly where there is a huge customer base. So, for example, where there are many millions of customers in the banking industry, it's the only practical way to both screen at account opening. It's the only practical way of screening overnight, and it's the only practical way of screening and monitoring transactions on a day-to-day basis. From a corporate perspective, non-regulated perspective, we see deal-specific due diligence now from a sanctions perspective, where we didn't see that really as an issue before. It's now de rigueur, and it's now a part of the lexicon when thinking about deals, and also when thinking about new facilities with banks by corporates. Corporates are now used to having detailed questionnaires, sanctions questionnaires, sent to them where they're asked to outline what it is they need to do in the context of sanctions compliance. That's a very, very quick flick through, and I'll hand back over to Mark now.
Thanks, Leah. So we're going to now focus on effectively top 10 tips really around implementing a sanctions compliance policy. So this is designed to distill much of what we've talked about so far in the session, and just highlight some of the fundamental things to think about, either if you're implementing a policy for the first time, or indeed just simply conducting a refresh or review of your policy. So just some very high-level things to consider as you start to plan or prepare or update your mitigating actions to handle sanctions. So let's move on to the next slide, and I'll go through some of these key elements. Okay, in fact, let me move these along so I can keep pace with those. So a couple of things to begin with. Obviously, when it comes to compliance with regulations in general, regardless of whether it's sanctions or anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, etc., it's absolutely critical that you have your senior management's backing, endorsement, recognition, and understanding that they have obligation to comply with the sanctions regime. Obviously, without your senior management's backing, you're going to find it very hard to secure the resources, the training, the tools you need to make sure your company is compliant. So that's absolutely key. And obviously, in your role as a risk manager or compliance officer, having a seat at the table with your senior leadership team is pretty fundamental in most cases. Now, obviously, based on that, you need to prepare your policy and your procedures, including those disclosure requirements. So you need to understand what you need to do if you do find a potential breach inadvertently where you may have broken a certain sanctions regime. How do you go about actually reporting that? And there may be some very special circumstances where actually you deem a certain transaction or a certain piece of business perhaps sitting outside the regime. So you may want to go and apply for a special license to actually conduct the business. So for example, in some cases where there may be a denial of services to the population, perhaps pensions or charitable donations or things of this nature, there are some rare occasions where licenses may be issued which enable a transaction to actually go ahead. So again, it's about familiarizing yourself with, what are those things you need to do in order to roll out your sanctions compliance policy. Now, if we then look at a few other things, obviously the next step is to make sure everybody in your business understands that. So again, fairly fundamental, but you need to be communicating that, making sure your employees, and as we've covered, key suppliers, agents, perhaps joint venture partners, any other entity that's very much exposed or potentially handling, your business on your behalf needs to be aware of what your policy is and how you're complying with that policy. That's often followed by regular training of staff. So again, really auditing that communication, making sure they've completed their training, you've captured that audit, you can demonstrate that to the enforcement agency if they have to get proof of what you've done and how proactive you've been at preventing sanctions breaches. And you may extend that training out to third parties you deal with. So again, your suppliers, agents perhaps, distributors, various entities that have a significant influence on how you conduct your business and potentially may have an exposure that puts you at risk to sanctions breaches. Now, following that, as Ian mentioned, things such as due diligence, screening, this is absolutely fundamental. And again, as we've already mentioned, this is very much risk-based. So agencies expect you to really understand your business profile, where you're conducting business, what markets, what supply chains, what customer base activity you have, to really understand where there may be potential exposure to sanctions breaches. And then it's about implementing a process and tools that are appropriate to the nature, size and risk of your business. So as I mentioned earlier, if you're a very, very small UK-based company, maybe only involved in extremely low risk, local activity in a certain market, it may be that just going off to the HM Treasury website, having a look at the sanctions list, perhaps is deemed adequate as a sanctions process. But obviously, the bigger your company, the more markets in which you operate, the more entities in which you're dealing with, including employees, the greater the need to have in place an appropriate system that scales to that. And again, that will be an expectation. The enforcement agencies will expect you to take responsibility and put in place processes that are fit for purpose and scale to the size of your business. Okay. There is obviously a link between that and how you then escalate and again have in place procedures to deal with those suspected breaches or issues or perhaps licensing requests. So again, having those in place so they're ready to go and you don't have to just try and make that up when you find out there's a problem and deal with that on the spot. And obviously what's key in a lot of cases with regulatory obligations is keeping a very clear audit of everything you're doing. So again, I mentioned that obviously the training element, you can obviously these days very easily record who's received the training, who's signed off on the training. You can keep a very thorough audit of all your sanctions checks, your due diligence checks, the due diligence information you've retained, when that was conducted, etc., when it was updated. So really, getting together that information you need in order to be able to demonstrate that you are proactive in preventing sanctions breaches and you have in place those adequate systems and controls to meet your business requirements. So that's really what it's about. It's about being able to demonstrate that you've done your best if it turns out, unfortunately, you become a victim of a potential sanctions breach. This is obviously going to help you when you come to have that awkward conversation with your enforcement agency. Other fundamental things to think about. One thing that's often a regular feature, obviously, is to have an independent audit. Again, depending on the size of your business, the nature of your business, to invite in external counsel, external consultants to not only check your policy and make sure that's correct and appropriate, but also to stress test the process itself. So to put through some scenarios to see if that process is fit for purpose and is going to withstand the pressure when potential breaches may occur. And again, number 10, fundamental, but don't wait for enforcement. Don't wait for trouble for you to suddenly take this seriously. Obviously, by then, it's far too late, and worst case scenario, you're going to be facing multi-million-dollar penalties and significant business impact, which is going to obviously completely undermine and affect your company's ability to operate. So again, this is pretty high level. A lot of it hopefully is fairly obvious, but these are some of the fundamental things to be thinking about when you're implementing or updating your sanctions policy. So I'll move on because we want to make sure we get time at the end for questions. So let me move on to the screening side of things. And again, if you have a company of any significant scale, how you go about practically screening all of these companies, partners, agents, employees, etc., to make sure you're doing your best to keep up to date on what is a very dynamic market and rapidly changing sanctions requirements. So again, another top 10 tips, this time more about the screening technology. So again, some fundamental things to think about if you are either purchasing or considering updating or replacing the screening software you have in place, the system in place to do this kind of checks. And again, a lot of this is very straightforward and would apply in many cases if you're purchasing any kind of online or system tool, but again, some things to cover on the list here. So obviously the first thing, setting out very clear requirements and objectives. So again, based on your risk assessment, based on the policy you've put together, the profile of your business, what kind of tool and system and software do you actually need? What kind of volumes do you need to screen? Often this is done on a daily basis to make sure you're absolutely up to speed on rapidly changing sanctions regimes. So again, looking at what you actually need. So how much screening, what kind of volumes, how many people, how many markets, how much content, so how many lists do you need to go through this thing, etc. And again, as with many of these services, you can obviously try before you buy. You can trial this service, you can have a look at it, you can put in some sample data, make sure it actually delivers what you expect. It's easy to implement, and you're not going to find that a challenge. And again, fairly obvious, but be in it for the long haul. Prepare for change. I mean, this is a rapidly changing environment. So again, you need to be thinking about ideally a system that you can use for a long time. You don't have to keep replacing every 12 months, 2 years, and getting all that disruption and cost in your business. So again, think about how that keeps up to date, the content, the new lists, the changing sanctions regimes. Think about how it can scale to your business as it grows or diminishes depending on how you're operating in certain markets, and the skill set of your employees, etc., that may be involved in managing that process. Again, integration, customization. So is this something that you're going to have locally hosted? Is it in the cloud? how you're going to use this application, and can it be tailored to fit your particular policy. So again, it's a certain labels or wording or things that you use that reflect your particular sanctions policy. Can the product be adjusted to reflect that, rather than you having to come up with some kind of matching to match what the product says versus what your policy says. Level of IT commitment, so again, fairly fundamental. Are you going to be looking after this yourself? Are you going to have IT resources of your own that take care of this? Or are you going to rely on the vendor to do that? Again, is it going to be installed locally? Is it going to be out on the cloud, etc.? Obviously, local language. I mean, these are fairly, again, basic things to consider, but if you are using this product in different markets, is it equipped to help your staff in those markets be able to get on and search and use the product? Can it handle different formats? So perhaps different languages, different name formats, different variations of names that may be used. So again, the ability for the product to take care of that and for you to make that far more efficient. Sufficient training support, again, very basic, but making sure that you've got people available when you need them, especially with a product like this, where it really is important. I think we've kind of stated that clear enough to have this in place and operating. Last thing you want to do is have a sanctions process that breaks down because you can't get hold of the support or the technology team to get your software back up and running. The management intelligence, the audit data, so the ability to capture statistics and data on the screening process, to be able to demonstrate to the regulator what you've done, when you did it, the amount of screening you're doing, perhaps the amount of people using the product, data which you may be able to use to help scale or justify additional cost or upgrades in the solution. So the ability for the product to produce that kind of reporting information. And then a couple of things, one internal, one external. Obviously, build in those regular reviews to make sure that your own business strategy continues to align to the requirements you have for the screening software. So if you're going off into other markets, does the screening software cover those lists, those sanctions regimes in those markets? Is it updating at the rate you expect? Can it cover these things we've seen above as your business expands or operates in different areas, different markets around the world? So again, being close to what your company's strategy is and making sure your sanctions policy evolves as your company's strategy evolves. And then similarly, your relationship with the provider of the solution, having those regular reviews, understanding what the roadmap is for that product. How is it being developed? How is it improving? Are there features coming in that are going to help the process be more efficient, maybe reduce some cost in some of your internal resources perhaps? So again, just keeping a close relationship with the vendor to make sure that you've got a good understanding on what this thing does and how it works and how it's improving. So again, as I said earlier, a lot of this hopefully is fairly common knowledge, but it's just good to capture that, to consider some of these fundamental things if you are either putting in place for the first time or considering replacing your existing sanction screening solution. Okay.
Yeah, great, Mark. Thank you very much for that presentation. I think we've done pretty well on time, and thanks also, Zia. So we're going to take some questions now. So we've had people writing in. I'm going to start with one that might be a bit controversial. Is the global sanctions regime falling apart because there's no longer agreement between the members of the UN? For example, we see a split between the USA and the EU in relation to Iranian sanctions, for example. And the question is, how can companies know what they need to do given the conflicting approaches to sanctions? I wonder if Zia would like to jump in on that first.
Yeah, no problem at all, Arthur. I mean, it's a great question, and I think actually for those people who have probably come to sanctions in the more recent past, it's probably a bit. They probably just don't realise that actually it's not unusual to have a divergent approach to international sanctions. So if before the writer is sort of referring to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action that was agreed by the global community back in 2016, before that, the world and the US had a pretty divergent view and approach when it came to Iran. If we go before sort of 2012, when the US was forging its own, applying its own furrow. So that's not unusual. I suspect that we're likely, when there's political uncertainty globally, you see differing jurisdictions taking differing approaches to their foreign policy, and so I think all we're seeing at the moment is a reflection of the election of President Trump and his views versus those of the EU as an example in relation to Iran. Whether we see this happening more and more often remains to be seen, I think.
Okay, great. Okay, let's move on to another question then. Mark, this one for you, I think. When performing a sanctions risk assessment, can you give 3 key things we might need to consider?
Yeah, and we've talked a little bit about some of these things earlier, but I think fundamentally, and Zia alluded to this as well, number one is understanding the markets in which you operate. So geographically, what's your business footprint? Which countries are you operating in? I mean, that's a kind of easy start in some ways to try and establish, are you dealing with what are already known sanctioned jurisdictions? And through your due diligence and screening process, again, you can be checking and looking out for individuals that may originate from some of those sanctioned jurisdictions or businesses or other entities. So that's number one, a geographic almost audit of your business. I think number two, I think as we've talked about, really thinking about your own business strategy and aligning to that as it changes and scales. So understanding the sanctions regime today obviously is going to change, as we're seeing all the time in this dynamic space, and you've got to make sure you're very aligned to your own company's strategy to make sure that the markets in which you're going into or exiting or thinking of partnering or whatever the strategy may be, it continues to be compliant with your sanctions policy. So I think that's number two, and we talked about that on the previous slide. And I think the third thing, outside of some of the standard sort of transaction and entity type criteria, for me it is that partnership, that collaboration with the board, that's fundamental. It's going to be a very risky policy if you don't have that endorsement and backing and that support by your senior board. So for me, those are some of the fundamental things to think about. But when it comes to risk assessment, there are some fairly standard criteria. And again, Zia alluded to some of the guidance that's out there, which you can consult from HM Treasury or from the Joint Money Laundering Steering Group, the Financial Conduct Authority, etc., that can help you put in place the risk assessment process, or indeed consult outside counsel for advice.
Okay, great. And Zia, I had a question actually about what do companies, what are the sort of 2 or 3 things that companies most typically get wrong when dealing with sanctions risk?
I think the 2 or 3 things that I would point to are probably, number one, fundamentally not understanding what their risk is, sort of connected to Mark's previous point and that previous question. And actually I see a couple of questions that we've got that are sort of linked to that as well, just around which jurisdictions they operate in, which laws apply, what does and doesn't apply to them, and what they do in circumstances where they come across something that might be an issue. That's really where I've seen people getting themselves tied up a little bit in previous pieces of work that we've done. Number one, and number two, I suppose it's also then not really disseminating information to the business as a whole. that training piece, not really understanding, making everyone else aware. Because, with the best will in the world, I mean, the screening systems, that Mark talked about, are fantastic and really complicated and great bits of kit, but they're only as good as the people that are working with them. There's no, it's going to make having a screening system less effective if you haven't got people trained in the context of what to do when something is a potential hit or not. And that's again where we've seen people fall down, not understanding what they need to do.
Okay, great. Anything you'd like to add to that, Mark?
No, I think essentially that's pretty much it. Yeah, I mean, those are the key points. Indeed, there are, in fact, enforcement examples. They do go back some time now, but within the UK banking sector, where firms were actually fined for not maintaining their sanction screening systems. So as Zia said, where they've taken on a product, an application, whatever, put that in place, but then not really kept it up to date, not checked it, as I said earlier, not reviewed how it might be more related to their current business strategy, and they have been fined on that basis. So yes, understanding those solutions, having your staff trained, and those regular reviews I mentioned earlier are very important.
Okay, let's move on to a question about insurance then. I'm not sure which of you would like to take this, but we've got a question there. What are the sanction compliance considerations for buying insurance or having claims paid? So what do you need to do to effectively get some insurance in this area?
I'm not sure whether Zia's got some comment on that. I mean, frankly, my own personal view, I don't think there's an insurance policy out there that's really going to protect you from breaking a sanctions regime. Personally, I don't think the OFAC authority in the US will be that concerned if you have an insurance policy. You might want to add a bit more to that, Zia.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, what you can get insurance for, obviously, is things like D&O policies that cover general investigations into conduct, etc. But you can't insure yourself against a criminal sanction, as it were, a criminal penalty. So that would be, you would be able to get that. I mean, if the question is more, I don't know if the question is based on that, or whether it's based more about what the insurance obligations are within that sector. But certainly, yeah, you can't get a policy that would insure you from that risk. But on the second point I just raised, sanctions apply to the insurance sector as they apply to everyone else.
Okay, I think we've probably got time for just one more quick one then. It's one that I had when I was listening to what you were saying and reading through some of the literature. What's the main thing that an organisation should do or have in place to make sure that their supply chain is risk managed in this area?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've probably covered most of those points actually, because ultimately, depending again on the nature of the business, the markets, etc., the policy and the screening process could be ported out to the suppliers themselves. So again, it's fairly common practice around areas such as anti-bribery, corruption, where a company will put in place a policy and then expect their key suppliers, their primary business partners, to sign up and implement those same standards. So I think ultimately it is about screening as far as you can up the supply chain, understanding the ownership of your suppliers. We alluded to earlier, having an individual who may be sanctioned is actually a shareholder or owner of one of your suppliers. So again, doing your checks, your due diligence on your suppliers is absolutely fundamental. And really, as I said, doing or demonstrating as much as you can that you're trying to mitigate those risks. You may not be able to prevent every occurrence, but at least you're trying and you're putting in place the adequate systems to show that you're taking steps to mitigate that risk. Okay,
great. Okay, well, I think that's probably all we've got time for today. There was some great content in there, some great information. So thanks to Mark Dunn from LexisNexis. Thanks for Zia Ullah for giving us some interesting insights. Thanks also for the attendees for taking time to join us today, send some questions in. I'm sorry we didn't get time to answer them all, but leave us some feedback, and hopefully we'll see you again sometime in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks.